So in the last two sections of this video series, I brought up two key strategic problems with the alt-right, both as they relate to using populist and democratic means of solving the problems they want to address, and also as they pertain to recruiting leaders. But part of the reason for pointing out these strategic flaws is to immediately demonstrate that the existence of these flaws on the alt-right aren't some stroke of bad luck. They emerge directly from the alt-right's identity as a racial movement. A movement with very little ideological impetus other than affiliation towards a biological identity. Indeed, the alt-right's own inability to directly confront the central problem of pathological modern culture, the alt-right's inability to directly and primarily confront the central problem of pathological modern culture, in essence, is what manufactures these two strategic problems. Now, of course, I know I'm going to get probably a lot of criticism from both the left and the alt-right listening to this series, because to this point it sounds like very weak tea. I mean, first, from the alt-right's critics, I haven't really made a moral criticism of the alt-right yet. All I have done is point out the strategic flaws and have, in some sense, linked them to an element of what the alt-right is, namely a racial identitarian movement. Moreover, on the flip side, to any alt-righters listening to this particular video, I haven't told you anything you don't already know. People on the alt-right are broadly aware that modern culture is pathological, that it leads to individualism and lack of discipline. They understand this problem. And moreover, I think they'd say something like the following: don't all movements have to deal with the issues of modernity? Certainly any political movement that's just not telling us that we should give in to total self-indulgence and individualist desires. Any movement that's going to be asserting hard realities against fantasy is going to have to come up against the problem that modern culture encourages people to embrace self-indulgent attitudes. Why, they would ask, is this only a purview of the alt-right? And I get it. As someone whose ideology largely stems from a traditionalist religion, I know that my own Catholic Church has had no easy time fighting against these very same problems. So do I have anything more to say? Is all the alt-right guilty of just ineffectiveness that stems from a cultural problem that will impede pretty much any counter-progressive movement? Well, as you might have guessed, the problem goes much deeper. And I think the first of these deeper problems stems from another leadership issue. Really, in many ways, the flip side of the previous problem. This leadership problem I like to call the Dark Knight problem. Now, a Dark Knight in popular terminology usually represents some leader that comes out of nowhere and has no connection to any other establishment, but just takes control, again in a time of crisis. But in my own analogy, I really want to contrast this figure with the figure of the White Knight. Whereas a White Knight figure would come in and take control of a society for the preservation and benefit of said society. A Dark Knight would come and take control for totally alternative motivations, perhaps even ideological or personal motivations. Whereas the White Knight's an unmitigated benefit for society, the Dark Knight's a wild card, and perhaps someone who can even do an incredible amount of damage. In essence, where the White Knight was a savior, the Dark Knight is, in some sense, an opportunist. And so the problem I think that the alt-right faces is that the movement as it stands will attract opportunistic, megalomaniac, and perhaps even psychopathic leaders. Leaders that will destroy the cause in the long run, despite the pretty words they'll tell their followers. Basically, as the movement fails to recruit and attract good leadership, it will become a beacon for terrible leadership. And I think there's a mechanism to explain this, but perhaps I can begin with an example of one such pathological leader. And of course, since we're talking about the alt-right, and I'm talking about opportunistic, short-sighted leaders, I'm sure everybody is thinking of Donald Trump. But I think there's a far more instructive example for us to examine in this particular instance. And I know I'm really going to court accusations of Godwin's Law, but really I'm speaking of none other than Adolf Hitler. And no, I'm not making the obvious, the alt-right are all Nazis canard that we hear so much from the left. I really want to examine this figure in a historical context. Now, I think because of the Holocaust, oftentimes we miss the real lesson of Adolf Hitler. Or at least one of the real lessons. We're so busy asking ourselves how bad Hitler was for Jews and Poles that we don't ask ourselves, how bad was Hitler for Germany? Because I don't care how far right you are. I don't care if you're an internet national socialist, but if you look at the objective facts, Hitler, and indeed much of the upper echelons of the Nazi Party, made decisions that drove Germany into the ground strategically and facilitated not only its ultimate destruction, but also of the total ethnic cleansing of Germans across Eastern Europe. A bloody tragedy that to this day we still hear almost nothing about. Oh, and I know people on the alt-right will whine about Stalin and Allied Bomber Command. But regardless of what you believe about Hitler's rivals, there's an inescapable fact that Hitler started the war and Hitler lost the war. Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and invaded Poland with the full knowledge this would likely result in war with Britain and France. It was Hitler that decided to facilitate a whole Western invasion, which further pushed the Allies away from any concept of a white peace, and then compounded that error by invading the Soviet Union, and subsequently declaring war in America after Pearl Harbor. Historians even have a joke that the most valuable commander the Allied forces had on their side during the last 5 years of World War II was none less than Adolf Hitler himself. All of his decisions were strategic catastrophes for the long-term interest of his country. And why? Hitler wasn't a dumb person. Hitler was in many ways a political genius. So why the strategic blunders when it came to securing long-term livelihood for his own people? Well, that's because Hitler wasn't actually interested in the long-term livelihood or well-being of the German people. He was interested in the short-term power and prestige of the Nazi Party. And historians will say this, whether it was long-term strategic decisions about whether to go to war against Russia, or even more minor decisions about the strategy around Dunkirk and Stalingrad. Every time a conflict presented itself, where the needs of Germany and the Reich were pitted against the needs and prestige of the Nazi Party, Hitler always picked the Nazi Party. And that's because Hitler's priorities were prestige. The image of himself as the leader of the German people, and the image of the German people and the German race as supermen standing astride the world and conquering it. This was the egotistical dream that Hitler was addicted to. This was the egotistical dream that many of the Nazi Party adherents were addicted to. And the priority of Hitler was to perpetuate this dream, not secure prosperity and safety for future German generations. The future generations at some point needed peace, but the propaganda always needed war. You know, I've heard that psychopaths have two qualities. One is a need always to feel adored and like they're the center of attention. And another is that they have a very low sensitivity to pain. And as such, you oftentimes see psychopaths mutilating themselves or even their children and loved ones, as long as they can be the center of attention, as long as they can be part of a narrative that paints them to be the hero. And if that's the case, Hitler and the Nazi Party were one spot-on instance of psychopathy. They were perfectly willing to drive their nation into the ground as long as they were the ones at the helm when it finally hit the ground. And you know, it's a great tragedy because a unified nationalistic government in Germany in the 1930s could have been the savior of Europe under different leadership. A Germany less focused on these weird myths of racial supremacy could have worked with Poland and the other Eastern European countries to push back and possibly even depose Stalin, who had already killed millions himself. And this would have resulted in much better lives, not only for the native residents, but also for millions of Germans living in Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. But of course, doing that doesn't convince your audience that you're the first scion of a 1,000-year empire of supermen. And of course, I'm well into this video, and probably most of the audience are wondering what I'm talking about. Great, I have proved that Hitler was a psychopath. Brilliant. What does this have to do with the alt-right? Well, I do not think that the election of Adolf Hitler was coincidental. There were mechanisms that made a person like that particularly appealing to people in the 1930s in Germany. And on a much lesser scale, I think the alt-right's in a similar position. Because of what it is, because of how it's organized, because of how it's described its own values, it will be a beacon for pathological leadership. And I think there are really two direct mechanisms for this. Now, the first mechanism, and I think this gets me back a little bit to why I felt the alt-right was fundamentally different than other dissident conservative movements, is that the alt-right is selling or providing racial identity and racial pride with really no prior ethical or ideological commitment. Now, people, and especially young men, are really in search of identity. It's something that we crave. And coming into contact with it on the alt-right feels good. It feels right. It feels natural. And there's even sort of, I think, an addictive quality to it. Now, I know what people on the alt-right will say. This is nationalism. This is group solidarity. This is something that every one of our ancestors would have had access to, would have been able to feel. It wouldn't have been questioned in previous ages, and to a large degree, they're absolutely right. This would have been naturally a part of any society before 60 years ago. But there's a problem because it would have been quite different. Pride in the group and identity with the group wouldn't have been sold in isolation. There would be an accompanying sense of duty, and that duty would stem from an even larger concept of ethics, an ethical obligation. I mean, you might feel proud to be German in 1910, but that wouldn't be some abstract notion that you just hold into yourself and feel warm and glowy. It would manifest itself in a need to volunteer, to actually help a real society you see in front of yourself, to actually help real people. But in the case of the alt-right as a movement, this racial and group identity is sold without any accompanying contact or loyalty to some real society. It's all hypothetical. It's all in the future. And if anything, contact with the alt-right facilitates a deep antipathy towards the outside society. Now, of course, in some sense, the societies deserve that, but it's an important observation to make because it makes this particular phenomenon different from those that have come before it. And of course, here I want to point out something that's critical, because as much as the alt-right rages against modernity, and it's certainly right to do that, it itself is a product of modernity. It's selling racial pride and group identity divorced from the cost of racial pride and group identity. It's an off-the-shelf pleasure at a click for something that would have in the past ages had been paid for by duty. And as such, it segues incredibly nicely into somebody thoroughly pathologically addicted to modernity, to indolence, to consumerism. Racial pride is easy. It feels good. And so it's no surprise that you see all these people doing pornographic alt-right memes with anime girls in SS uniforms. It's consumeristic. But of course, the consumerism isn't the main issue. The issue is you're creating an audience of people whose primary loyalty is not to a real society or to a real people, but to a grandiose notion of a racially pure society in a past that may not have even really existed in the way it's being portrayed. The people who consume alt-right media may very well not be concerned with the real community. They're concerned with the hypothetical one and the identity that the hypothetical community conveys to them. In many cases, it might be loyalty to a fantasy, and I'm saying that as somebody who thinks loyalty to a people and to a nation is perfectly healthy. But the particular way it's developing online may not be. But of course, how does this lead to the problems of megalomaniacal leaders? Well, there's another big mechanism also in play here, and this really has more to do with the left than the right, and that is paranoia. Somewhat justified paranoia, but paranoia nonetheless. The left is on a witch hunt for racists. Everybody knows that. But as left increases to turn the thumbscrews, creating more and more penalties for people who dissent on the subjects of race, the alt-right will be increasingly on the lookout for leaders who can bravely flaunt the taboos and shove the standards in the face of the left. And indeed, there's good reason for this. As the pressure goes up, the right will see many of its leaders cuck and essentially sell out their own movements to keep their position in the power hierarchy. And there will be demand for a leader that people can trust on the right. But how can you trust anyone when the left keeps on cutting sweeter and sweeter deals for those who defect and putting more and more punishments on those who don't? So how do you solve this problem in the leadership? Well, Obviously, by counter-signaling, by looking for leaders who take more extreme and more extreme and more extreme positions, to the point where the left won't buy them off because the left doesn't want them. I mean, a leader who dresses and looks like David Brooks might always sell you out and call the movement you belong to racist, but the guy who has a tattoo of a swastika on his forehead, you know he's solid. And so, as the strategic problems that I mentioned in the first two videos cause the alt-right to take loss after loss politically and culturally, the right, and indeed the alt-right in particular, is going to have a growing number of depressed, despondent members, desperate to see some leader, any leader who could possibly turn back the tide. Somebody who, first, won't betray them, and second, will have the courage to get things done and really confront their enemies in the most brutal possible terms. The extremeness and even the insanity of those leaders won't be a bug, they'll be features. And thus, you have the two main components of what I would argue leads to a pathological and megalomaniacal leader. A group of people who associate with and are identify with a hypothetical community more than they do a real one, and a paranoid growing demand for extremism in order to counter-signal against the perceived enemy. The result is not hard to see in terms of leadership. The community will hoist up any extreme leader who will promise to preserve this identity, who will promise to bring forth this future hypothetical community, and mostly who presents himself as willing to go to any ends to accomplish these tasks, even to the extent that he might harm the real, living communities his own group occupies in order to celebrate and procure the hypothetical future. If a community demands leaders like this, it's a psychopath's dream, because it perfectly accommodates their need for adoration, along with their callousness towards actual people's lives. And I think this is a huge problem, because the alt-right, if it's organized and works the way it does now, will attract these leaders. Now, before I close out this section, I think I need to make one big clarification for the alt-right listeners who might be watching this video. I know the alt-right isn't comprised of sociopaths. I've met a lot of alt-right people on the internet in the last year, and for the most part, they tend to be very friendly people. In fact, as I've mentioned before, there are many alt-right YouTubers, most prominently among them Reactionary Expat and Millennial Woes, who I really admire. And when I made my initial video saying that I was going to do a series about what's wrong with the alt-right, and indeed when I finished that series by saying that the alt-right would lead the West to ruin, I did feel for a moment like I was being too harsh, and that people like Millennial Woes might take this personally. But believe me when I say, this is my genuine concern, because in spite of the fact that I've met many good people in the alt-right, I've also experienced the converse. More than a few people that I felt have had deeply callous and perhaps even psychopathic personalities, people who would go to any length. And indeed, these people are minor, they don't have big YouTube channels. All movements have got weirdos and crazies sticking on the sides. But the movement as it stands isn't what concerns me, because I think I know what direction this is going. As the alt-right advances, as it staggers and takes losses, the rank and file aren't going to want leaders who ruminate thoughtfully on the problems of modernity and wistfully look back. In the future, the alt-right is going to want action. They're going to want men of action, extreme men of action, people who will set the world on fire. And for a movement entirely based on affinity towards a future white racialist movement that does not yet exist, I'm not so sure what will be restraining those leaders. I know the callous exists in every movement, but there's a future in the alt-right that will demand that the callous take the reins. And that frankly scares me, though I'll touch on that a little more in future videos.